Kokota is a tiny islet in the Zanzibar archipelago off the coast of Tanzania in East Africa. It's only about 2.5 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, and for the most part, life looks a lot like it would have 100 years ago. It's not the kind of place you'd expect to find people innovatively adapting to climate change. But that's exactly what they're doing. Life here hinges on solving huge problems. Things like deforestation, water shortages, and a collapsing fishery. Climate change is making all of their problems even worse. These are, of course, the same huge issues facing the planet at large. And that's what makes Kokota so important. They're on the front lines with nowhere to run, and their survival depends upon their ability to adapt. Kokotans are rising to the challenge, and the world should be paying attention.
Here at Moncton High School, after a great presentation to our grade 11s and 12 students, happy to introduce filmmaker, especially documentary filmmaker, award-winning filmmaker, Craig Norris. Thanks so much for coming first to Moncton High and then coming on with Rogers TV, and just tell us about your journey into filmmaking and the passion and how you came about finding that passion.
Yeah, I guess for me, I always wanted to be a filmmaker, particularly a doc filmmaker. And when I was in high school, I even kind of flirted with the idea of going to film school. But I come from a pretty conservative family. And honestly, I thought if I told my dad I wanted to be a filmmaker, would be on par with like telling him I wanted to be an astronaut. So it didn't seem feasible. So what I wound up doing was I got a business degree. But in business, I focused on marketing. And the reason I focused on marketing was because I was always interested in television commercials. And not so much the selling part, but more on how like a 30-second commercial can really change the way that people think about something and change the way that they act. So I started off in business and then worked in marketing for a few years, and kind of got completely, I hated working in the corporate world. I worked at the lottery and my job was to convince more people to spend more money gambling, and it just made me feel terrible. So I knew that I wanted to do something in film and photography, and I thought about, maybe I should go back to school after my business degree. And I decided that I already had enough school. I had taught myself how to teach myself. So I decided to independently study. And my fiance at the time, my wife now, we moved into a car. I literally bought a camera on the way out of town.
Wow.
And we drove from Moncton across Canada up to Alaska, down to Costa Rica, and then back up to Moncton. And I independently studied photography and filmmaking, and pretty much made the choice to focus on photography first. I kind of had this epiphany when I was in Alaska that I needed to learn how to take one picture at a time before I did 24 frames a second. So I did photography for 5 or 6 years, and then an opportunity came up to direct a doc, and the photography business had taken off. I had almost kind of forgotten about docs, But as soon as that opportunity came up, I pounced on it, and I've been making docs ever since. So it's been about 5 years now.
Mbaruk thought if he could figure out how to get trees in the ground in Pemba, if he could prove he was able to help communities, that he might be able to attract support for Kokota. Mbaruk also knew he couldn't tackle island-wide reforestation alone, so he recruited Jeff Schnur, a 21-year-old Canadian tree planter.
I came to Pemba a few years ago, 7 years ago now, and I was just living here. I was trying to write a novel at the time, didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, and I was tree planting, when I wasn't traveling, And Embargo kind of heard that I was a tree planter, came, and we spent several long evenings just discussing, what tree planting could look like here in Pemba. So in the early days when I first met Embargo, we were just traveling to communities. We were talking about the ideas of tree planting, looking at the ways that communities could collect seed, establish nurseries, plant trees. It was all pretty, fairly amateur. We didn't have a lot of the expertise, but we had a lot of drive and motivation. And that first year, we were able to grow 100,000 seedlings within 7 communities. I think the success of the project really surprised both of us. It was just that perfect time in history and the perfect place with the right people where a vision becomes reality. We had no idea that we would ever be able to grow that many trees in communities. We didn't have any idea what it was going to turn into.
So growing up in St. John, did you ever think that you would have this opportunity? You talk about opportunity. Did you ever think that it would be this soon in your photography and filmmaking career to have so many awards and to have the opportunities?
It definitely seemed, until relatively recently, not realistic. Just the idea of even trying to figure out how to make a movie. There's not a lot of filmmakers in New Brunswick. It's a very small community. I didn't know how to get involved in the community. So no, I never, I thought it was always going to be maybe someday, but I never kind of thought I would get there. But then as I kind of made those big leaps to independently study photography and just doing things like photo exhibits, it could start to kind of build off those smaller projects.
Right.
So maybe 10 years ago it didn't seem very feasible, but then 9 years ago it was well, maybe this is feasible. Maybe there is a future in this, and all those little projects just kind of have built up to this. So,
what would you say for an up and coming, filmmaker, or, for students with aspirations to become a filmmaker? What's your advice for them?
Basically to do it. In New Brunswick or St. John or Moncton, we have this attitude that we're from New Brunswick, there's no industry, we can't do it, and that's all bull. We are whatever we say we are. That's always been my experience. When I said I was a business person and a marketer, that's what I was. When I said I was a photographer, that's what I was. When I started saying I was a filmmaker, that's what I became. So especially now in this era where everything's available online, there's so much that you can teach yourself online that the biggest thing is just to start. So if you're thinking about being a filmmaker, the best thing that you can do is make your first crappy movie. They'll only get better after the first one. So stop procrastinating and start making.
Talk about filmmaking, a very influential project. Just take us through your newest project and the travels that led you to that community.
Yeah, so one of our latest releases is called Kokota, the Islet of Hope. It's the film that we screened here at Moncton High today. That film is about climate change adaptation in Southeast Africa. And it's kind of how did a guy from Moncton that started making movies 5 years ago wind up in Southeast Africa? And basically what happened is there's an NGO in Sackville called Community Forest International, and they had seen one of my previous projects and they really liked it. And the EU was really impressed by Community Forest International's work in Africa. Wow. And they said, we want a documentary because we want to show it to more places in Africa, but more places in the world to try to inspire people to emulate this model that was created in Kokota and in Pemba. So my name got thrown into the hat, and I went through an interview process, and I was selected. And it was, there's been a lot of things over the last 3 or 4 years that have just been mind-blowing. Every time the phone rings, filmmaking is a really weird industry. I never know what my next job is going to be, and you're always worried about work, but the longer I do it, there seems to always be another project, and every project seems to be bigger than the last. So.
Wow. Just take us through, so conservation and politics, they kind of go hand in hand, unfortunately. Just take us through your travels around the world and how politics really influences conservation and climate change.
I was pretty insulated from the politics of Pemba. When I was there, I traveled with the main character, Mbarok, and his team. And we didn't talk a lot about politics like in the present day, but he told me what things were like in the past. You know, in Pemba, just less than 10 years ago, they have a corrupt government that was kind of installed, and it wasn't reflective of the result of the election in Pembans. In the opinion of most Pembans. So they were doing peaceful protests in the street. The government sent in the military and just started shooting people. Like these are the types of things that are happening in some of these countries in Africa. I don't want to use it as a blanket statement. Not all countries are like that in Africa, but these are the kind of challenges that they face. So you can imagine when things like that are happening, conservation may not be as high on the radar as you would like. But then you watch Kokota, the Islet of Hope, and in many ways their conservation and climate change adaptation projects are ahead of ours. So despite their weak economy, despite their corrupt government, they're making great progress in fighting climate change, and they're fighting climate change that they didn't even cause. Like we burnt all the fossil fuels, and now they're dealing with the ramifications of that.
And they're establishing renewable energy sources, which that's monumental.
Yeah, so they're pursuing, solar power is a big thing in Africa right now. I'm working on a new film in Malawi, and solar power seems like it's going to be a solution in Malawi as well. And it works really well in places like this because you don't have to set up big, expensive transmission lines. You don't need this the infrastructure that we set up, 80 years ago, 70 years ago. You don't need that nowadays. You can have a more wireless solution to power. So those are the types of things that are happening in Africa despite all the other problems that they're facing.
How difficult is it from a filmmaking perspective to capture, the struggle of daily living in a third world country?
I think with Kokota, the poverty is pretty abject. Like you walk out the door and you see it. It's right in your face. The most difficult part, I guess, is when you go into these communities. Like I was in communities where I was the first white man they'd ever seen. So I tend to attract a crowd, So most of the communities I went into, you can't just walk in there like a news crew and just start shooting. Like you have to meet the people, you have to go and meet the elders in the community, you have to introduce yourself, you have to tell them why you're there and what your intentions are. And then it just is going to take some time to not have a crowd of 100 kids following you around everywhere you go, literally 100 kids, eventually they'll get bored with you and then you can get back to shooting. But for the most part, the poverty in the communities in Pemba is pretty abject, so it's shootable once you get around those other hurdles.
Kokotans worked with Mbarok's team around the clock for months to complete the water tank and the school. Digging the hole for the tank's foundation was by far the most difficult job. The people of Kokota had to smash a 1.5 meter deep hole into solid rock by hand. Their tenacity paid off, and in March of 2012, Kokotans were finally able to turn on a tap.
Kwa kweli ilikuwa kama ni dream kiasi ambacho watu hakuamini. Ilikuwa magi sijui ni hadithi nisimulie vipi, lakini kitu ambacho kama kwenye macho yao hivi hawaamini, japo kule kitu kinaonekana, lakini kwa kweli ilikuwa ni faraja, labda niseme ni furaha kubwa, lakini kama kitu ambacho kama ndoto ambayo walikuwa hakuitazamia, leo matokeo yake imekuwa kweli.
It has to be inspirational for you to shoot, the film and then have some success from a filmmaking standpoint.
Yeah, we have 3 films out right now, and I've never applied to international film festivals before. And I went into it with a pretty laid-back attitude. Let's just throw these out there. Let's not stress out about it. Let's just see how things do. And they're all performing really beyond expectations. So Kokota has been picked up by 11 festivals around the world and counting. So I think it's in 7 or 8 countries on 4 continents or something. And it won at the Atlantic Film Fest. It won at Planet in Focus, which is Canada's biggest eco film fest, and it won in DC at the Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital, and that's the biggest eco festival in the world. So it was, it was pretty shocking to win there. It was funny how it went down because I actually didn't even know that we had gotten into the festival. I just got this email saying like, "Oh, you won at DC EFF," and I said, "Oh, I didn't know I was in." So that's pretty cool. Because they're going to screen that film at National Geographic Society headquarters. Wow. So I started off as a photographer emulating the National Geographic look, dreaming of working for National Geographic. So to do anything related to that organization, to me is like literally a dream come true.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, our own country. In your opinion, has Canada done enough currently on climate change and conservation?
No, it's a total joke. We go on about like how poor the province is and the recession and all these sorts of things, and then you look at a place like Kokota and it's like, no, those are people that have no money. Like our country is a rich country and we should be leading the charge against climate change, and we're not a leader in climate change. And you don't even have to look very far to see that, like look at a Google Earth image of New Brunswick and like look at the crazy amount of clear cutting that's going on in an endangered forest type. The Acadian forest is a unique forest type found nowhere else on Earth that's been officially endangered, since the late 90s, and we're still mowing it down. So conservation, we're not doing anywhere near enough on the conservation front, and on the climate change front, we're doing things like entertain the idea of like pipelines and things. Like what Canada should be doing right now is putting a whole bunch of money into renewables, and they shouldn't be doing it like even on just like an ethical basis. We should be doing it because it makes good business sense. Right. Like the world is switching over to renewables. Wind and solar are kind of leading the charge, and I think Canada wants to be a leader in that field. Like we don't want to be playing catch up. Like that's going to be a big market for us to tap, and for some reason our leaders don't seem to see that.
Well, especially with the Bay of Fundy, and you've done some work, with regards to the Bay of Fundy. Even tidal power would be sufficient for this area.
Oh, for sure. I think there's huge opportunities there with tidal power. We have to be careful about how we do it, how much power we get out of the bay.
Right.
But I think diversification of renewables is really going to be the solution. Like solar power is going to be part of the solution, hydropower is going to be part of the solution, and tidal power can be part of the solution. And especially in a place like New Brunswick. Like we've got the brain power in this province to run a nuclear power plant. Right?
Yeah.
But we can't figure out how to make a windmill. We put over $1 billion into Point Lepreau, and we're saying that we can't put more money. Like, let's take all those geniuses that are running that plant, because they are smart guys. I know a lot of the guys down there. Yeah. Let's stick them on tidal power. Let's stick them on solar power. Let's stick them on wind turbines. Yeah. And that's our little province. Imagine if we had that national focus as a country. Like we could do it if we tried. We just need the will.
So, Craig, in your opinion, can one person elicit change with regards to climate change?
Yeah, of course. It's the actions of one person are probably the only thing that ever have made a difference. Like everything starts off, the biggest movements of our time have started off by one really passionate person. You don't have to look much farther than the dock, Kokota. If you look at the change that they were able to make in Pemba, that started off with one guy, Mbarek Musa Omar. The guy was living in a mud hut and was amongst like the poorest people on earth, and he met a 21-year-old guy from Sackville that had like a high school education. He wasn't running an NGO. He had no idea, kind of how foreign development worked. And Mbarek asked Jeff if he knew how to plant trees. That's how that whole story started. And they went on to plant 1.3 million trees on Pemba. They went on to make rainwater collection, harvesting systems. They installed solar power grids. And these are not two MIT trained people. Right. You know what I mean? These are just two people that set a goal for themselves and started working towards it. So yeah, I think one person can definitely make a huge difference in their community.
Let's talk a little bit more about your past projects here in Canada, and especially in our home province of New Brunswick.
Yeah, well, it's technically our latest release. Kokota came out in September, but Surviving the Fundy Footpath came out in February. So right now, Surviving the Fundy Footpath follows mega novice hiker Bruce Prasad. He's a guy from Toronto who had never slept in a tent, and it follows Bruce as he tries to complete the treacherous Fundy Footpath, which is a 60-kilometer trail that runs from St. Martin's, New Brunswick, all the way through to Elma. So we filmed his 5-day attempt. And we did that project for a couple of reasons. One, we want to raise the profile of the footpath. We want more people to come and hike it, but we also want more New Brunswickers to hike it. New Brunswick seems to have like a little bit of an identity crisis going on. We call ourselves the drive-through province, and that's only true, like we made that name up, So like this is trying to combat that and show, no, we're not a drive-through province, like we're a drive-to province. We have lots of cool things. So we wanted to show the footpath to New Brunswickers and the world. And then there was a lot of safety issues on the footpath because a lot of first-time hikers were hiking it, and they underestimated how hard that trail was. Right. So we thought, well, if we could follow someone that didn't have any hiking experience, you would be able to learn from watching Bruce's experience. And then the overarching theme around this is that it's kind of like a cloaked conservation project, because when we have a lot of hikers hiking an area, when industry goes in and says they want to clear cut it, people put their foot down and say, no, not here. You're not going to get to clear cut here. So that's kind of that project.
Well, Craig, we wish you all the best in future endeavors, and thanks for taking the time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Hali ya kuja kuwa mdogo na sasa ni tofauti, lakini sasa kutakwenda kwa kutwa nzima, kunarudi mikono mitupu, bahari haina kitu kavu.
Tulikaa miaka mingi kile kisiwa, baadaye kikapotea ule msitu. Imekuwa sasa tambarare, imekuwa sasa hamna nguvu, mle msitu hamna.
Joto linakuwa linaongezeka. Hili ni janga kubwa sana kwa kisiwa chetu. Ardhi inabakia ardhi halia, na mateke yake jua linakuwa linapiga na kuikausha ile resources iliyoko under the ground.
When you look at the whole planet, you can get overwhelmed. But Kokota, it's this microcosm, it's this world unto itself.
Cha ajabu ni kwamba watu wa Kokota walipoamua sasa kwamba tayari wakafahamu kwamba tumeshaharibu. Kama tumeshaharibu, sasa wajibu wetu tutengeneze. Ni mfano mzuri wa kuigwa kiasi ambacho pahala popote katika dunia, basi na wao kama wataamua washaharibu.
We have everything we need. It's not even about sacrifice, it's about changing. I mean, our ability to adapt is only limited by our ability to learn.